The pond was empty for the first time in 70 years, and Claire Donovan stood at its muddy edge, staring at the rusted iron wheel that shouldn't have been there. It jutted from the cracked lakebed like a bone from an old grave, half buried in silt that smelled of decay and forgotten time. The April sun beat down on her neck, but she felt cold, the kind of cold that starts in your chest and spreads outward until your fingers go numb. Her grandfather's land stretched 300 acres in every direction, rolling hills of Northern California gold country that had been in the Donovan family since 1852. Now it was hers alone, and it was drowning her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Claire was 41 years old, a widow for 8 months, and the sole heir to a property that was worth everything on paper and nothing in her bank account. Thomas had died in September, a heart attack while checking fence lines on the eastern pasture. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. They'd been married 19 years, and in that time they'd poured every dollar they had into keeping the ranch operational, modernizing the irrigation systems, repairing century-old outbuildings, maintaining equipment that should have been replaced decades ago. Thomas had believed in the land the way some people believe in God, with a faith that required no evidence beyond the soil itself. Claire had believed in Thomas. Now both were gone, and she was left holding a mortgage payment of $4,000 a month on a property that generated barely enough income to cover utilities. The pond had started leaking 3 weeks ago, a crack in the earthen dam that her grandfather had built in 1955 to create a reliable water source for the cattle. At first, it was just a trickle, a damp spot on the downstream side that Claire had noticed during her morning walk. Within days, it had become a steady stream, then a torrent that threatened to wash out the dam entirely and flood the lower pastures where she kept her remaining 30 head of cattle. The engineer she'd called had been blunt. The dam needed immediate repair or complete reconstruction. Estimated cost, $65,000. Money she didn't have. Money she couldn't borrow against a property that was already leveraged to its limit, so she'd made the only choice available to her. She'd rented pumps from a contractor in Sacramento, industrial units that ran on diesel and made a sound like the world ending, and she'd begun draining the pond. The process had taken 11 days, watching the water level drop inch by agonizing inch, revealing the muddy bottom that hadn't seen sunlight since Eisenhower was president. The plan was simple. Drain the pond, inspect the dam structure, make whatever temporary repairs she could afford with the $3,000 she'd scraped together from selling Thomas's truck, and pray it would hold until she could figure out something more permanent. The wheel changed everything. Claire had been walking the exposed lakebed that morning, checking for debris that might interfere with the repair work, when she'd seen it. At first she'd thought it was just another piece of old farm equipment, the kind of rusted junk that accumulates on working ranches over generations. But as she got closer, she realized it was different. The wheel was massive, nearly 5 feet in diameter, with iron spokes radiating from a wooden hub that had somehow survived decades underwater. It was attached to something larger, something still buried in the mud, and the craftsmanship was wrong for farm equipment. Too ornate, too carefully made. She knelt in the muck, her jeans soaking through immediately, and began digging with her bare hands. The mud was thick and cold, clinging to her fingers as she worked to expose more of the object. Within minutes she'd uncovered what appeared to be the side panel of a wagon, wooden planks held together with iron brackets and decorative metalwork that spoke of wealth and care in its construction. This wasn't a farm wagon or a utility vehicle. This was something meant to be seen, to make an impression. Claire sat back on her heels, her heart pounding. Her grandfather had never mentioned anything about a wagon in the pond. Neither had her father, who died when she was 16, leaving the ranch to her grandfather to manage until Claire was old enough to inherit. The family history she knew was straightforward. Patrick Donovan had come west during the gold rush, worked claims in the Sierra foothills, made enough money to buy land, and established the ranch that had supported 4 generations of Donovans. There were no dramatic stories, no legends of hidden wealth or mysterious disappearances, just hard work, careful stewardship, and the kind of quiet persistence that built something lasting. But a wagon didn't end up at the bottom of a pond by accident. She pulled her phone from her pocket and called the only person she could think of who might have answers. Robert Chen had been Thomas's best friend since high school, a history professor at the State University who specialized in Gold Rush-era California. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice warm with the kind of concern that came from checking on her too often since the funeral. "Claire, how are you holding up?" "Robert, I need you to come out to the ranch. Today, if you can. I found something in the pond." There was a pause, and she could hear him shifting papers on his desk. "What kind of something?" "A wagon. Old one. Really old. It's buried in the mud at the bottom of the pond." Another pause, longer this time. "Claire, are you sure it's a wagon? Could it be old farm equipment?" "I'm sure. Can you come look at it?" "I'll be there in 2 hours." She spent the waiting time continuing to dig, using a shovel she'd retrieved from the barn, to carefully remove mud from around the wagon's frame. The more she exposed, the more questions arose. The wagon was lying on its side, as if it had tipped or been pushed into the water. The wooden panels were remarkably preserved, protected by the mud and cold water from the rot that should have claimed them decades ago. The iron fittings showed intricate scrollwork, the kind of decorative detail that would have been expensive even in the 1,850 seconds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the time Robert's silver Toyota pulled up the long dirt drive to the ranch house, Claire had exposed most of one side of the wagon and part of the cargo bed. She was covered in mud up to her elbows, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had come half loose, and she was shaking despite the afternoon heat. Not from cold or exertion, but from the growing certainty that she'd found something significant, something that might change everything about what she thought she knew about her family's history. Robert climbed out of his car wearing khakis and a button-down shirt that would be ruined within minutes, but he didn't seem to care. He was in his mid-40s, lean and energetic, with the kind of intellectual intensity that made him light up when presented with historical puzzles. He'd been a good friend to Thomas, and he'd been a good friend to Claire in the months since the funeral, checking on her, helping with paperwork, never pushing but always available. She was grateful for his presence now, for someone who could help make sense of what she'd discovered. They walked together down to the empty pond, Claire leading the way along the muddy slope that descended to the exposed lakebed. The pumps were still running at the far end, draining the last pools of water that collected in the deepest depressions. The smell of exposed mud was overwhelming, organic and ancient, the scent of things that should have remained buried. Robert saw the wagon and stopped walking. His expression shifted from curiosity to something sharper, more focused. He approached slowly, the way you might approach something dangerous or sacred, and knelt beside the exposed framework. "My God," he said quietly. "Claire, this is a Concord coach." "A what?" "A Concord coach, built by Abbott Downing Company in Concord, New Hampshire. They were the standard for overland transportation in the 1,850 seconds and 60 seconds, stagecoaches, freight wagons, private coaches for wealthy families. This decorative ironwork, these suspension fittings, this is absolutely a Concorde." He ran his fingers along the exposed wood, his touch reverent. "And it's in remarkable condition." Claire felt her chest tighten. What would a Concord coach be doing at the bottom of my grandfather's pond? That's the question, isn't it? Robert pulled out his phone and began taking photographs, documenting the wagon from multiple angles. These coaches were expensive, really expensive. We're talking several $1,000s in 1,850 seconds currency. Only wealthy people could afford private coaches like this. Miners who struck it rich, merchants, professional gamblers, people with serious money who wanted to travel in style. My family wasn't wealthy, Claire said. We've always been working ranchers. Comfortable sometimes, struggling other times, but never wealthy. Your great-great-grandfather Patrick came here during the gold rush, right? 1,849 or 1,850? 1,852. Family story is that he worked claims in the foothills, saved his money, bought land. Robert stood, his eyes bright with the thrill of discovery. What if the family story isn't complete? What if Patrick Donovan made more than just enough to buy land? What if he made real money? The kind of money that would let him afford a private Concord coach? Claire shook her head. Then where did the money go? Why would we have been struggling all these years if my ancestors struck it rich? Maybe it didn't go anywhere. Maybe it's still here. Robert gestured to the wagon. Why else would someone sink a valuable coach in a pond? You don't do that unless you're hiding something. The implication hung between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Claire looked at the wagon, at the muddy lakebed, at the hills rolling away in every direction under the April sun. Somewhere overhead a hawk called, the sound thin and lonely in the vast sky. The land her family had worked for 4 generations suddenly felt different, as if the ground itself was shifting beneath her feet. We need to excavate this carefully, Robert said. Document everything. If there's something inside the cargo area, we need to handle it properly. I can't afford to hire archaeologists or historians. I can barely afford to fix the dam. I'll help. I can bring some graduate students, people who know what they're doing. We'll treat this as a research project. He looked at her, his expression serious. But Claire, you need to understand something. If we find what I think we might find, if there's anything of value inside that coach, it's going to complicate your life in ways you can't imagine right now. There will be legal questions, ownership issues, publicity. The state might claim rights to historical artifacts. Other potential heirs might come forward. This could get messy very quickly. Claire thought about the mortgage payment due in 3 weeks, about the dam that needed repair, about the 30 cattle depending on her for water and feed, about the property taxes and equipment maintenance, and all the relentless financial pressure that had been crushing her since Thomas died. She thought about the choice in front of her. Walk away from whatever was buried in the mud, make her temporary repairs to the dam, and continue the slow slide toward bankruptcy and foreclosure. Or dig deeper, risk complications she couldn't predict, and possibly find something that might save everything. Let's excavate it, she said, carefully and properly. But let's find out what's down there. Robert nodded, already pulling out his phone to make calls. I'll get a team together. We can start tomorrow morning. That night, Claire sat on the porch of the ranch house her great-great-grandfather had built, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The house was too big for one person, too full of memories of Thomas, of her childhood with her father before his death, of her grandfather's stories about the old days when the ranch had employed 6 full-time hands and run 300 head of cattle. The silence was oppressive sometimes, broken only by the wind in the oaks and the distant sounds of cattle settling for the night. She thought about Patrick Donovan, the man who'd started it all, who'd come west with dreams of gold and somehow ended up with land instead. She'd seen exactly one photograph of him, a daguerreotype taken late in his life, showing a stern-faced man with a magnificent beard and eyes that seemed to look right through you. There was nothing in his expression that suggested secrets or hidden wealth, just the weathered determination of someone who'd survived hard times through sheer stubbornness. But people kept secrets for all kinds of reasons. To protect themselves, to protect their families, to avoid questions they didn't want to answer. If Patrick had indeed struck it rich during the gold rush, if he'd acquired wealth that went beyond what he'd publicly acknowledged, why would he hide it? And why in a wagon at the bottom of a pond that wouldn't exist for another 100 years? The timeline bothered her. Patrick had bought the land in 1852. Her grandfather had built the pond in 1955. That was over a century apart. If the wagon had been hidden by Patrick, it couldn't have been in the pond. So, when had it ended up there? And who had put it there? She went inside and retrieved the old family Bible from the living room shelf, the one that contained birth and death records for 4 generations of Donovans. She'd looked through it countless times growing up, tracing her lineage, but now she examined it with different eyes, looking for gaps or inconsistencies in the record. Patrick Donovan, born 1,828 inches Boston, died 1,891 inches, California, married to Sarah Mackenzie in 1851. 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. His oldest son, Michael, had inherited the ranch and run it until his death in 1923. Michael's son, William, her grandfather, had taken over and built the place into a profitable operation before age and changing economics had forced him to scale back. Her father, James, had tried to modernize and expand in the 1,980 seconds, but commodity prices and drought had defeated him. And now Claire, the last Donovan, was trying to hold on to something that seemed determined to slip through her fingers. There were no mentions of unusual wealth in the family records, no references to gold strikes or windfalls, just the steady accumulation of land and livestock, the patient building of something meant to last. But absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence, as Robert liked to say. Just because the family didn't talk about something didn't mean it hadn't happened. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, Claire dreamed of mud and metal, of wheels turning in dark water, of her grandfather's face superimposed over the stern features of Patrick Donovan in the old photograph. When she woke before dawn, the questions were still there, heavy and insistent. What was buried in the wagon? Who had hidden it? And what would it cost her to find out? Robert arrived at 7 in the morning with 3 graduate students and a truck full of equipment. They worked through the day with the careful precision of trained archaeologists, documenting every inch of exposed wagon, taking samples of the wood and metal for dating analysis, photographing every detail from multiple angles. By afternoon, they'd cleared enough mud to access the cargo bed, and that's when everything changed. The interior of the coach contained wooden crates, 4 of them, remarkably preserved by the airtight seal that had formed as mud pressed against the wagon's exterior. Robert insisted on opening them one at a time, with full documentation of the process. The first crate contained books, leather-bound volumes that had somehow remained dry inside their sealed container. Gold Rush-era journals, account ledgers, personal correspondence, historical treasures that would tell scholars about daily life in mining camps and frontier towns. The second crate contained clothes, men's formal wear that spoke of wealth and status, silk vests, fine wool coats, gold cufflinks, and watch chains. The kind of garments a successful man would wear when he wanted to display his prosperity. The third crate was heavier, and when they pried it open, Claire's breath caught in her throat. Inside, packed in straw, were canvas bags sealed with wax. Robert lifted one carefully and opened it. Gold coins spilled into his palm, double eagles minted in San Francisco in the early 1,850 seconds, each one worth $20 in an era when that was a month's wages. There were dozens of bags, maybe hundreds of coins, but it was the fourth crate that made Robert go pale. Inside were leather satchels filled with gold dust and nuggets, the raw product of mining operations, and beneath those, wrapped in oilcloth, were more coins. Not American currency this time, but foreign gold. British sovereigns, Mexican pesos, coins from a dozen nations, the kind of diverse wealth that suggested someone who'd operated in international commerce. "Claire," Robert said quietly, his voice tight with suppressed excitement and concern, "this is a fortune, an absolute fortune. At current gold prices, just the raw metal value is probably several $1,000,000. Add the numismatic value for the coins, the historical significance, and we're talking about a discovery that will make national news." Claire stared at the open crates, at the wealth that had been hidden beneath her land for longer than she could calculate, and felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. This wasn't salvation, this was complication beyond anything she'd imagined. Questions would come now, questions she couldn't answer. Where had this wealth come from? Who had the legal right to it? And what had happened to the person who'd hidden it so carefully at the bottom of what would eventually become her grandfather's pond? The sun was setting over the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Claire of fire. The land looked the same as it always had, rolling and golden under the California sky. But everything had changed. The wagon wasn't just hiding gold, it was hiding a story, and that story might destroy everything Claire thought she knew about her family, her inheritance, and the land she'd been fighting so hard to keep. The news broke 3 days later, not because Claire wanted it to, but because one of Robert's graduate students posted photographs on social media before anyone could stop him. By the time Robert called to apologize, the images had been shared thousands of times. Local news stations arrived by noon, their satellite trucks churning up dust on the ranch road. By evening, the story had gone national. Widow discovers gold rush treasure on family land. Millions in gold coins found in sunken wagon. California rancher uncovers fortune hidden for over a century. Claire stood at her living room window, watching news crews set up cameras at the edge of her property, and felt her privacy dissolving like sugar in water. The phone rang constantly, reporters requesting interviews, lawyers offering representation, prospective buyers making unsolicited offers on the property. She stopped answering after the first dozen calls, letting the machine pick up, listening to voices promise her wealth, fame, legal protection, anything she might want if she'd just talk to them, just sign here, just let them handle everything. Robert came by that evening, exhausted and apologetic. The graduate student had been dismissed from the project, but the damage was done. The California State Parks Department had already contacted the university, asserting potential claims to the artifacts under historical preservation laws. The county assessor had called to discuss property tax implications, and someone claiming to be a distant Donovan relative had appeared at Robert's office with a genealogy chart and questions about inheritance rights. "I'm sorry," Robert said, sitting at Claire's kitchen table with coffee he wasn't drinking. "I should have been more careful about who I brought onto the site. I should have made everyone sign confidentiality agreements." Claire shook her head. "It would have come out eventually. You can't hide something like this." She paused, looking at the stack of phone messages on the counter. "Robert, I need you to be honest with me. What are the chances I actually get to keep any of this?" He was quiet for a long moment, and that silence told her everything she needed to know. "It's complicated. The gold itself, found on private property that's been in your family's continuous ownership, you probably have a strong claim. But the historical artifacts, the coach itself, the documents, those might fall under different regulations. And if anyone can prove the gold was stolen or illegally obtained originally, that opens another set of problems entirely. So, I found a fortune that might bankrupt me in legal fees trying to claim it, possibly, Or you could negotiate with the state, donate some items in exchange for clear title to the rest, work with museums on shared custody arrangements. There are options, but none of them are simple. He finally met her eyes. The real question is where this gold came from originally. Because that's what everyone's going to ask, and the answer might determine everything. Claire had been thinking about that question constantly since they'd opened the crates. Patrick Donovan's public story was that he'd worked mining claims, saved carefully, and used his earnings to buy land. Modest success, nothing spectacular. But the wealth hidden in the wagon suggested something else entirely. Either Patrick had struck it far richer than family history recorded, or the gold had come from somewhere else, somewhere he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The next morning brought Frank Morrison to her door. She recognized him immediately, though she hadn't seen him in 15 years. He was her father's cousin, technically her second cousin, a man in his late 60s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, but none of the contentment that should accompany it. Frank had left California decades ago, after some kind of falling out with Claire's grandfather, moved to Nevada, and never looked back. Now he stood on her porch with a lawyer beside him and an expression that mixed calculation with old bitterness. "Claire, you've grown up." "Frank, it's been a long time. Not long enough for you to forget family obligations, I hope." He gestured to the man beside him. A sharp-eyed attorney in an expensive suit that looked ridiculous on a ranch. "This is David Kellerman. We need to talk about the gold you found." Claire didn't invite them in. "I don't think we have anything to discuss. That's where you're wrong. Your grandfather cheated my father out of his share of this ranch back in 1962. Forced him to sell his half-interest for a fraction of what it was worth. My father died broke because of that, and I've been waiting a long time for justice. Now you find millions in gold on property that should have been partly mine, and you think we don't have anything to discuss." The story was one Claire had heard before, though never from Frank's perspective. Her grandfather, William, and his brother, Thomas, Frank's father, had jointly inherited the ranch from their father, Michael, in 1945. The two brothers had worked it together for 17 years before Thomas decided he wanted out, wanted to take his equity and move to Los Angeles, where he believed his future lay. William had bought him out, taking a loan to cover the payment, and Thomas had indeed moved to Los Angeles, where he'd failed at 3 different business ventures and died in 1975, having never reconciled with his brother. "Your father wanted to sell?" Claire said. "My grandfather bought his share at a fair price." "Fair?" Frank's laugh was bitter. William knew the ranch was worth 3 times what he paid. He knew Thomas was desperate for cash because of debts, and he took advantage, used family loyalty as a weapon to force a lowball price. That was 60 years ago. The statute of limitations on any claim expired decades before I was born. Kellerman, the lawyer, stepped forward. "Perhaps on the property itself, but the gold is a different matter. If it can be proven that this treasure was hidden on the ranch during the period when both brothers owned it jointly, then Frank has a legitimate claim to half its value. We're prepared to file suit if necessary." Claire felt something cold settle in her chest. This was how it would go. Not celebration or relief, but lawyers and lawsuits, family grievances dragged up from graves, everyone wanting a piece of something they'd never worked for. "Get off my property." "We'll be in touch," Kellerman said, handing her a business card she didn't take. "Think carefully about your position, Miss Donovan. Legal battles are expensive, and from what I understand, you're not in a position to afford them." They left, and Claire stood on her porch shaking with anger and something deeper, a sense of violation that went beyond the immediate threat. The land that had been her sanctuary, the place where she'd built a life with Thomas, where she'd planned to grow old, suddenly felt contaminated by outside claims and ancient resentments. Everyone wanted something from her now, and none of them cared what it cost her to give it. Robert returned that afternoon with news that was somehow both better and worse. His analysis of the documents found in the first crate had revealed something significant. The journals belonged to Patrick Donovan, and they told a story that complicated everything Claire thought she knew about her family's origins. Patrick hadn't just worked mining claims, he'd owned them, several of the most productive sites in the northern goldfields. He'd employed dozens of miners, operated sluices and stamp mills, and built a fortune that would be worth tens of millions in today's currency. But the journals also revealed something darker. Patrick had been involved in the kind of rough justice that characterized Gold Rush California, serving on vigilance committees that dispensed summary judgment to accused thieves and claim jumpers. Some of the entries described hangings, beatings, the confiscation of property from men Patrick and his associates deemed unworthy of legal protection. He wasn't just a successful miner, Robert said quietly. He was part of the power structure that ruled the goldfields through intimidation and violence. Some of the wealth in those crates probably came from men he helped execute or drive out. Claire felt sick. So the gold might be stolen, legally acquired by the standards of 1,850 seconds, California, which had almost no functioning legal system. Morally? Robert shrugged. That's a harder question. The men Patrick targeted were often themselves thieves and criminals. But the vigilance committees also went after Mexican and Chinese miners, drove them from productive claims, took their gold. It was ethnic cleansing dressed up as frontier justice. Why would he hide it? If he acquired it legally, even by rough standards, why sink it in a wagon? That's what I can't figure out. The journals stop abruptly in 1859. No explanation, just blank pages after an entry dated September 14th, 7 years after he bought this land. Something happened that year, something that made him hide his wealth and apparently never retrieve it. Claire walked to the window, looking out at the land that suddenly felt layered with secrets and lies. Patrick Donovan wasn't the honest workingman of family legend. He was a wealthy mine owner who'd participated in violence, who'd accumulated a fortune through means that ranged from ruthless business practices to outright theft, and who'd hidden that fortune so thoroughly that his own descendants had lived in ignorance of it for generations. There's something else, Robert said. One of the last journal entries mentions a son, Michael, Patrick's oldest boy. Says Michael had learned about certain business practices and was threatening to expose his father to authorities in Sacramento. Patrick was trying to decide whether to pay him off or, and this is a quote, handle the problem more permanently. He was threatening his own son? The relationship was clearly toxic. Michael knew things Patrick wanted kept quiet, and Patrick saw him as a threat rather than family. Robert paused. Michael inherited this ranch when Patrick died in 1891. Ran it until 1923. What if he found the gold? What if that's why it ended up in the pond? The implications spread through Claire's mind like cracks in ice. If Michael had discovered his father's hidden wealth, he might have moved it, hidden it somewhere he controlled. The pond didn't exist until 1955, but before that there had been a natural depression in that area, a low spot that collected water during wet years. Michael could have buried the wagon there, intending to retrieve it later, but died before he could. Then William, Claire's grandfather, unknowing of what lay beneath, had built the dam and created the pond, sealing the treasure underwater for another half-century. It's just a theory, Robert said, but it fits the timeline and explains why the gold was never recovered. Claire's phone rang again, the 15th call that hour. She ignored it, but the sound reminded her of the pressure mounting from every direction. The state wanted the artifacts. Frank Morrison wanted his claimed share of the gold. Reporters wanted her story. And underneath it all was a more fundamental question that no one else seemed to care about. Did she even want wealth that came from sources like this? Could she accept money that might have been taken from murdered miners, from displaced Chinese workers, from all the people her great-great-grandfather had victimized in his pursuit of fortune? Thomas would have known what to do. He'd had a moral clarity about right and wrong that Claire had always admired, even when it made life harder. He would have looked at this situation, considered all the angles, and made a decision he could live with. But Thomas was gone, and Claire was alone with choices that felt impossible. Sarah Whitmore arrived the next afternoon without warning, driving up in a dusty pickup that suggested she'd come a long way. She was in her 70s, Native American, with long grey hair and eyes that seemed to see through Claire's defences immediately. She introduced herself as a representative of the Maidu tribe, whose ancestral lands included much of the territory where Patrick Donovan had operated his mining claims. "We've heard about your discovery," Sarah said, accepting the coffee Claire offered more out of reflex than hospitality. "And we need to discuss what it means. I'm not sure I understand. Your ancestors' journals mention several mining sites. 3 of them were on land that was sacred to my people, burial grounds that Patrick and his men desecrated to reach gold-bearing gravel. The wealth you found was extracted from earth that held our ancestors." Claire felt the weight of it, another layer of complication, another group with legitimate grievances. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't. That's how these things work. The crimes get committed, the perpetrators get rich, and generations later their descendants inherit both the wealth and the ignorance that makes them think they deserve it." Sarah's voice wasn't angry, just tired and sad. "We're not here to take your gold. We're here to ask that some of it be used to protect what's left of our sacred sites, to preserve what your ancestor tried to destroy. That seems fair. Does it? Or does it just seem like the minimum decency requires?" Sarah set down her coffee cup. "Your people took everything from mine, Miss Donovan. Land, resources, lives, culture. You found a fraction of that stolen wealth, and you're being asked to share a portion to help undo some of the damage. That's not fairness. That's the bare beginning of accountability." Claire didn't have an answer. Sarah wasn't wrong, but the accumulated weight of everyone's claims was crushing. Frank Morrison wanted half the gold because of a decades-old family dispute. The state wanted the historical artifacts. The Maidu wanted reparations for cultural destruction, and Claire just wanted to keep her ranch, to maintain the land Thomas had loved, to have some measure of security in a life that had become terrifyingly uncertain. "I'll work with you," Claire said finally. "Whatever I end up able to keep, a significant portion will go toward preservation of Maidu sites." Sarah studied her for a long moment. "I believe you mean that now. We'll see if you still mean it when lawyers and accountants start calculating what significant means." After Sarah left, Claire walked down to the empty pond where the wagon still sat, now protected by a temporary shelter Robert's team had erected. The mud had dried in the California heat, cracking into geometric patterns that made the lakebed look like shattered pottery. The wagon itself seemed smaller than she remembered, less impressive now that she understood what it represented. Not adventure or romance, but theft and violence and secrets passed down through generations. She thought about her grandfather, William, who'd built the pond, never knowing what lay beneath. She thought about her father, James, who'd worked himself into an early grave trying to make the ranch profitable. She thought about Thomas, who'd believed in this land with a faith that had ultimately killed him. None of them had known about Patrick's crimes or Michael's hidden treasure. They'd just worked hard, lived honorably, and tried to leave something meaningful for the next generation. Was she obligated to atone for sins committed before she was born? Did inheriting land mean inheriting guilt? And if she gave away the gold to satisfy everyone's claims, what would she be left with? The ranch itself, still mortgaged, still struggling, still demanding more than she could provide. Robert found her there as the sun was setting, his shadow stretching long across the dried mud. "I've been going through more of the documents. There's a letter from Michael to Patrick, dated 1859, the year the journals stop. You should read it. He handed her a photograph of the letter, the original too fragile to handle carelessly. The handwriting was elegant but angry, the ink pressed hard into the paper. "Father," it read, "I can no longer remain silent about your business practices. The men you have killed, the families you have destroyed, the sacred places you have defiled in pursuit of wealth, all of it weighs on my conscience in ways you seem incapable of understanding. You raised me to believe in justice and honor, yet your own actions mock those values daily. I am leaving California. I want no part of your fortune, no benefit from wealth acquired through such means. The land you have purchased may be legally yours, but it is morally stained by the blood of innocence. I pray you find redemption before you face final judgment, though I doubt such redemption is possible. For one who feels no remorse, your son in name only, Michael." Claire read it twice, feeling pieces of the puzzle slide into place. Michael didn't find the gold and hide it. Patrick did. He hid it because his son was threatening to expose him, and he couldn't access his wealth without drawing attention. That's my reading too. Patrick probably planned to retrieve it eventually, after things settled down. But he died first, in 1891. By then Michael had inherited the land, but he'd made it clear he wanted nothing to do with his father's fortune. The gold sat hidden, and Michael never looked for it. So it passed through 4 generations, each one working hard to build something modest and honest, never knowing there was a fortune beneath their feet the whole time. Ironic, isn't it? Patrick built his wealth through violence and theft. His descendants built their lives through honest labor. And now you've found the original fortune, and it's threatening to destroy everything the honest generations built. Claire looked at the wagon, at the dried mud, at the hills rolling away under the evening sky. The land was the same as it had always been, indifferent to human drama, unchanged by discoveries or revelations. Grass would grow whether she kept the ranch or lost it. Cattle would graze these hills under someone's ownership. The land would persist while human claims and counterclaims dissolved into history. "What would you do," she asked Robert, "if you were in my position?" He considered for a long moment. "I'd try to find a way to keep the land while honoring the legitimate claims against the gold. Negotiate with the state. Work out an agreement with Frank that doesn't bankrupt you. Support the Maydew preservation efforts. Use what wealth remains to secure the ranch's future. But don't let the gold corrupt the life you're trying to build. That's assuming there's anything left after everyone gets their piece. There probably will be. Even with all the claims, we're talking about several $1 million in gold. But more importantly, you'll know you handled it with integrity. That you didn't let Patrick's crimes define your family's legacy going forward. Claire wanted to believe it was that simple. But standing there in the gathering darkness, watching shadows spread across the land, her family had worked for 4 generations. She felt the weight of impossible choices. Keep the gold and fight everyone who claimed a piece of it, spending years in legal battles that would consume both money and spirit. Or give away most of it to satisfy competing claims, keeping just enough to secure the ranch, but losing the financial security the discovery had briefly promised. Either way, something would be lost. Either her integrity or her security, either her moral standing or her material future. The land would remain, but her relationship to it would be forever changed by what she'd found buried beneath its surface. "I need time to think," she said finally. Robert nodded. "Take what you need. But Claire, don't let this destroy you. Your grandfather, your father, Thomas, they all loved this land because of what it represented, not because of what might be hidden underneath it. Whatever you decide about the gold, remember that." He left, and Claire stood alone as stars emerged overhead. The empty pond stretched before her like an open wound, and somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to each other with voices that sounded like laughter or grief, depending on how you listened. The decision came to Claire not in a moment of clarity, but in the slow accumulation of sleepless nights and long walks across land that had witnessed more history than she'd ever imagined. She spent a week avoiding phone calls, ignoring the reporters camped at the end of her drive, letting the pressure build until she either broke or found solid ground beneath her feet. What she found wasn't answers, but something more fundamental, an understanding of what the land meant beyond ownership or wealth, beyond the crimes of ancestors or the claims of distant relatives. Thomas had taught her that, though she hadn't fully understood it while he was alive, he'd walked these hills every morning not because they belonged to him, but because he belonged to them. The distinction seemed subtle, but it changed everything. Ownership was a legal fiction, a piece of paper filed in some county office. Belonging was written into your bones, earned through labor and loss, through seasons of drought and plenty, through the choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. She called Robert first, asking him to arrange a meeting with representatives from all the interested parties, the State Historical Commission, Frank Morrison and his lawyer, Sarah Whitmore from the Maidu tribe, the county tax assessor, everyone who'd made claims or demands or suggestions about what should happen to the gold Patrick Donovan had hidden over a century and a half ago. The meeting took place in the community center in town, a drafty building that smelled of old coffee and floor polish, where folding chairs scraped against linoleum and fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Claire stood at the front of the room, looking at faces that ranged from curious to hostile to carefully neutral. She'd prepared no speech, written down no talking points. She simply told them what she'd decided. "The gold belongs to everyone and no one," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "My great-great-grandfather acquired it through means I can't defend and wouldn't want to. Some of it was probably earned legitimately, but enough came from violence and theft that keeping it all would make me complicit in crimes I can't undo. So here's what I'm proposing." She outlined her plan with the directness of someone who'd spent too many nights wrestling with moral complexity and emerged wanting only simplicity and honesty. The historical artifacts, the journals and correspondence, and the Concord coach itself would go to the State Historical Society for preservation and public display. The story of Patrick Donovan's fortune and the violence that built it would be told completely, without sanitizing or romanticizing the gold rush era's brutality. Half the gold's value, roughly $2 million after expert appraisal, would be divided between the Maidu tribe for sacred site preservation and a fund Claire would establish to support small ranching families facing financial hardship. The kind of families she'd nearly become after Thomas died, people whose land was worth everything on paper and nothing when the bills came due. Frank Morrison would receive $200,000, not as acknowledgement of any legal claim, which Claire maintained he didn't have, but as recognition that family disputes had left wounds that money might help heal, even if it couldn't erase history. The payment came with one condition: that Frank acknowledge in writing that this settled all claims against the ranch and Claire's inheritance. The remaining gold, after taxes and legal fees, would go towards securing the ranch's future, paying off the mortgage, repairing infrastructure Thomas had deferred because money was always tight, creating an endowment that would generate income to supplement the ranch's operations and ensure she could maintain it properly without constant financial crisis. "I'm not trying to profit from my ancestors' crimes," Claire said, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "But I'm also not willing to lose the land 4 generations worked honestly to maintain. This proposal doesn't make anyone completely happy, and maybe that's how you know it's fair." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush her. Then Sarah Whitmore stood, her expression unreadable. "You're giving us more than I expected. More than I thought you'd be willing to part with. Why?" Claire thought about how to answer, about all the complicated feelings she'd worked through during those sleepless nights, because keeping stolen gold would poison everything I'm trying to preserve. The land has value beyond money. My marriage, my family's history, the life Thomas and I built here, none of that gets better by adding wealth that came from other people's suffering. I want to be able to walk these hills without carrying that weight. Sarah nodded slowly. Then we accept, and we'll work with you to make sure the story gets told right. So future generations understand what the gold rush cost our people. Frank Morrison took longer to decide, conferring with his lawyer in whispered conversations that Claire couldn't hear. Finally, Kellerman stood. My client accepts the proposal, with the written acknowledgement as specified. Though for the record we still believe he has legitimate claims to a larger share. Noted, Claire said, feeling something loosen in her chest. Anyone else have objections or counter-proposals? The State Historical Commission representative, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Patricia Holmes, rose with a folder of documents. We'd like to formalize the artifact transfer with proper documentation and ensure the Donovan family story is presented in full context. We're not interested in hero worship, but we are interested in historical truth. If you're willing to work with our research team, we can make this happen in a way that serves both preservation and education. I'm willing. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, working through details and logistics, but the fundamental decisions had been made. When it finally ended and people filed out into the parking lot where evening was settling over the valley, Claire felt exhausted and somehow lighter. Not happy exactly, but satisfied that she'd found a path that honored both her practical needs and her sense of what was right. Robert walked her to her truck, his professional historian's demeanor giving way to the warmth of genuine friendship. You did good in there. Not everyone could walk away from that much money. I'm not walking away from it. I'm using it the way it should have been used from the beginning, to support community instead of individual wealth. Thomas would be proud. The words hit harder than Claire expected, bringing sudden tears she'd been holding back for hours. Thomas had been gone 9 months, and she still reached for him in moments like this, still turned to share observations or ask opinions before remembering he wasn't there. The gold wouldn't bring him back. The secured ranch wouldn't fill the empty side of the bed. But maybe she could build something he would have valued, a legacy that matched the values he'd lived by. The next 3 months moved, with the grinding slowness of legal processes and the sudden speed of life continuing despite grief. Papers were signed, accounts were established, artifacts were transferred to climate-controlled museum facilities. The Concord coach was carefully excavated from the pond bed and transported to Sacramento, where conservators began the delicate work of preservation. The pond itself was repaired, the dam reinforced with modern engineering that would last another 70 years if properly maintained. Claire used some of the money to hire ranch hands, 2 young men from town who needed work and wanted to learn the cattle business. She upgraded equipment, fixed fences that had been barely functional for years, and began the slow process of rebuilding the ranch into something sustainable. Not the sprawling operation her great-great-grandfather had run through exploitation and violence, but a modest working ranch that treated land and animals and people with the respect Thomas had always insisted they deserved. Sarah Whitmore visited regularly, working with Claire to identify locations on the ranch where Maidu artifacts had been found over the years. There were grinding stones near the creek, evidence of seasonal camps where Claire's ancestors had unknowingly built corrals and equipment sheds. Sarah brought tribal elders who blessed the sites, performed ceremonies that acknowledged both the sacredness of the land and the complicated history it held. Claire participated when invited, learning prayers in a language that predated English by millennia, understanding in new ways that her ownership was recent and temporary compared to the indigenous connection to these hills. My grandfather used to say the land remembers everything. Sarah told her one afternoon while they stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. Every footstep, every birth and death, every act of violence or kindness. You can't erase what happened here, but you can choose what you add to the memory. Claire thought about Patrick Donovan, about the violence he'd committed and the wealth he'd accumulated and hidden. She thought about Michael, who'd rejected that wealth on moral grounds and lived modestly rather than profit from his father's crimes. She thought about the generations between Michael and herself, all working honestly, all struggling, all maintaining connection to land that held secrets they'd never suspected. "I want to add something good," Claire said. "Something that doesn't require anyone else to suffer. Then you're already different from your great-great-grandfather. The rest is just follow-through." Frank Morrison surprised her by visiting in September, driving down from Nevada, without warning but without hostility either. He looked older than when she'd seen him at the meeting, more worn down by life than bitter about it. They sat on the porch drinking iced tea while cattle grazed in the distance, and he told her things about her grandfather she'd never heard. "William was hard," Frank said. "Harder than he needed to be sometimes, but he loved this place in a way that wasn't always healthy. He saw keeping the ranch together as a moral obligation, like he owed something to the ancestors. When my father wanted out, William took it personally, thought Thomas was abandoning family duty. Did he cheat your father?" Frank was quiet for a long moment. "Probably not by the letter of any contract, but he used family pressure and Thomas's guilt to get a price that benefited William more than was fair. My father regretted selling for the rest of his life, but not because of the money, because William made him feel like he'd failed some test of worthiness. I'm sorry that happened. Me too, but I'm also sorry I let it make me bitter. Spent 40 years resenting William, and later your father, for inheriting something I convinced myself should have been partly mine. The gold seemed like vindication, like proof I'd been cheated. But standing in that meeting, hearing you give most of it away, I realized I'd been angry about the wrong things." Claire refilled his glass from the pitcher beside her chair. "What are you going to do with your share?" "Put it toward my grandkids' college funds, try to give them opportunities I never had. Maybe take my wife on a vacation she's been wanting for 20 years. He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Not exciting, but honest. "Feels right." After he left, Claire sat on the porch until stars emerged, thinking about family and inheritance and the weight of expectations that passed from one generation to another like genetic traits. She'd inherited this ranch, but she'd also inherited assumptions about what it meant to be a Donovan, to maintain land and honor ancestors and carry forward something begun over a century ago. The gold had forced her to examine those assumptions, to decide which parts of her heritage deserved preservation and which needed to be left behind. The museum exhibition opened in November, a comprehensive presentation of Gold Rush history that centered Patrick Donovan's story without celebrating it. Claire attended the opening, walking through galleries that displayed her great-great-grandfather's journals alongside testimonies from Chinese miners who'd been driven from their claims, from Maidu people whose sacred sites had been destroyed, from the wives and children of men Patrick's vigilance committee had hanged. The Concorde coach sat in the center gallery, beautifully restored, with placards explaining both its craftsmanship and the violence that had paid for it. Dr. Holmes found Claire standing in front of a display of the gold coins, their surfaces gleaming under museum lighting. "We've had incredible response to the exhibition. Thousands of visitors, school groups, researchers. Your decision to let us tell the complete story, including the uncomfortable parts, has created something genuinely valuable. Does it bother people? Seeing their Gold Rush mythology complicated? Some people, yes, but more are grateful for honesty. History is messy and morally complex, and pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone understand how we got to where we are now." Holmes gestured to the broader gallery. "Your family's story isn't unique, but it's well documented enough to serve as a lens for understanding an entire era. That's the real treasure, not the gold itself. Claire drove home that evening as autumn rain began falling, the first significant moisture since spring. The land would drink it gratefully, grass would green, and the pond that had revealed its secrets would fill again, covering the depression where the Concorde coach had rested for so long. By spring, you wouldn't be able to tell anything had been disturbed, though Claire would always know what lay beneath. She found herself thinking about Thomas more easily now, without the sharp pain that had characterized early grief. He'd believed the land was worth preserving not because it generated wealth, but because it connected him to something larger than himself, to the work of generations and the promise of continuity. The gold hadn't changed that fundamental truth. If anything, discovering the violence beneath the ranch's founding had clarified what actually mattered: the honest labor, the careful stewardship, the daily choice to add something good to the accumulated memory. The ranch hands she'd hired were working out well, young men who wanted to learn traditional ranching skills in an era when that knowledge was increasingly rare. She'd begun mentoring them the way Thomas had once mentored her, teaching them to read the land's signals, to understand cattle behavior, to fix equipment with ingenuity when parts weren't available. It felt right, passing forward knowledge that had nothing to do with Patrick Donovan's gold and everything to do with the patient work of generations who'd refused to profit from others' suffering. December brought the first snow, dusting the hills white and making the ranch look like the photograph she'd seen of it from the 1,920 seconds, before electricity or modern conveniences, when people lived closer to the rhythm of seasons and land. Claire walked out to the pond one evening, watching snow fall into water that was rising steadily with winter rains. The surface was smooth and dark, reflecting nothing, revealing nothing. You'd never know what had been hidden there, never suspect the secrets that had waited in mud and darkness for someone to finally drain the water and look beneath. She thought about calling someone, Robert or Sarah or even Frank, to share this moment of quiet reflection. But some things were meant to be experienced alone, witnessed only by the land itself. She'd made her choices, distributed Patrick's stolen wealth as fairly as she could, and secured the ranch's future without compromising her sense of right and wrong. The gold was gone, scattered to purposes she could defend, and what remained was what had always mattered: the land itself and her connection to it. Spring came eventually, as it always did, with new grass and new calves, and the endless work of maintaining fences and equipment and livestock. Claire fell into the rhythm of it gratefully, rising before dawn and working until exhaustion made sleep possible without dreams. The ranch wasn't making her rich, but it was sustaining itself now, generating enough income to cover expenses and contribute to the endowment that would ensure its survival through future droughts and market downturns. She hired a part-time ranch manager in March, a woman named Elena Rodriguez, who'd grown up on a ranch in northern Mexico and brought expertise in sustainable grazing and water management. Together, they developed plans to improve the land's productivity without degrading it, rotating cattle through pastures to allow recovery, protecting riparian areas, maintaining wildlife corridors through the property. The work felt like making amends, not for her own actions but for Patrick's, treating the land with care that acknowledged its value beyond what could be extracted or exploited. Robert visited in April with news that the museum exhibition was touring nationally, reaching audiences far beyond California. Academic papers were being written about the gold rush's impact on indigenous communities, using Patrick Donovan's well-documented violence as a case study. High school history curricula were being revised to include more honest portrayals of Western expansion and its costs. The gold Claire had given away was generating value that would compound over generations, educational impact that might help future Americans understand their history with more nuance and less mythology. "You started something important," Robert told her over coffee in the ranch kitchen. not just by finding the gold, but by being willing to examine what it represented and make hard choices about what to do with it. I didn't do anything special, just tried to be honest. That's rarer than you think. Most people find ways to rationalize keeping wealth, regardless of its origins. You didn't. After he left, Claire walked out to check on the heifers in the east pasture, following a path worn by generations of Donovan feet. The land rolled away in every direction, golden grass moving in waves under a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Thomas had loved this view, had stood on this spot countless times watching sunrise paint the hills with light. She could almost feel him beside her, could almost hear his voice pointing out details she'd have missed on her own. The gold was gone, but the land remained. Patrick Donovan's crimes were acknowledged, but the honest work of generations stood as counterweight. The past couldn't be changed, but the future could be shaped by choices made in the present, by deciding that some things mattered more than wealth, that integrity and stewardship and connection to land were worth preserving even when easier paths presented themselves. Claire stood on the hill as afternoon shadows lengthened, watching her cattle graze and her ranch hands check fence lines and the mountains rise purple in the distance. The pond was full again, its surface reflecting clouds and sky with no hint of what it had once revealed. Some secrets stayed buried, and some came to light, but either way the land persisted, holding memory and possibility in equal measure, offering chances for redemption to anyone willing to work for it honestly. She'd found treasure beneath her grandfather's pond, and in giving most of it away, she'd discovered something more valuable. Not wealth that could be spent or stolen or fought over, but clarity about who she wanted to be and what she wanted the Donovan name to mean going forward. Not conquerors or exploiters or accumulators of stolen fortune, but stewards who understood that true wealth was measured in soil health and water quality, and the satisfied tiredness that came from honest labor under open sky. The sun touched the western hills, and Claire turned toward home, toward the ranch house that had sheltered 5 generations of her family, and would, if she did her work well, shelter more. Behind her, the land breathed quietly, remembering everything, judging nothing, offering itself again to those who approached with humility and respect. And that, Claire understood finally, was the real inheritance. Not what lay buried beneath the surface, but what grew from it when given the chance. 2 years passed like seasons, each one leaving its mark on the land and the woman who tended it. Claire Donovan turned 43 in October, standing on the same ridge where she'd stood the day after distributing Patrick's gold, and found herself measuring time differently now. Not in calendar months or anniversary dates, but in the slower rhythms that governed ranch life. Calving seasons and harvest cycles, drought, years and years of plenty, the gradual healing of soil that had been overgrazed, and the return of wildlife to corridors she'd protected. The ranch was producing again, modest but sustainable, and the endowment she'd established generated enough income that financial panic no longer woke her at 3 in the morning. She'd paid off the mortgage 6 months earlier, burning the final paperwork in the fireplace, while Elena and the ranch hands cheered. The act felt ceremonial, like breaking chains that had bound her family for generations to banks and lenders, and the constant pressure of debt that made every decision about the land contingent on money rather than wisdom. Sarah Whitmore had become something between a friend and a teacher, visiting monthly to walk the property and share knowledge about plants and animals that Claire's education had never included. The Maydew Preservation Fund had purchased 3 parcels of ancestral land, protecting sacred sites from development and creating spaces where tribal members could practice ceremonies and teach children about connections to place that predated European arrival by thousands of years. Sarah spoke about this work with quiet satisfaction, and Claire understood that the gold, tainted as its origins were, had enabled something genuinely valuable. "Your great-great-grandfather tried to erase my people from this valley," Sarah said one afternoon, while they stood near the creek where grinding stones still marked ancient camps. "Now, his descendant is helping us reclaim what he tried to destroy. That's not redemption exactly, but it's something. A different story than the one he started." Claire had learned to sit with observations like that, to not rush toward easy absolution or defensive justification. Patrick Donovan's crimes couldn't be undone, and her good intentions didn't erase harm done generations before her birth. But she could choose what story continued, what the Donovan name would mean going forward. Not conquest or accumulation, but stewardship and repair. Small actions that acknowledged debt without claiming credit, that tried to leave things better than she'd found them. The museum exhibition had indeed traveled nationally, and Claire received letters occasionally from students and historians who'd seen it. Some thanked her for honoring indigenous perspectives. Others criticized her for not giving away all the gold, arguing that keeping any portion of stolen wealth was morally indefensible. She read them all without responding, understanding that her decisions would be judged differently by people with different values and experiences. What mattered wasn't universal approval, but her own ability to live with the choices she'd made. Frank Morrison sent a Christmas card that first year, photographs of grandchildren with brief notes about college plans and family gatherings. The gesture felt like closure, the kind of distant acknowledgement that family relationships sometimes allowed after decades of estrangement. He'd taken his share of the gold and done exactly what he'd said, invested in education and experiences rather than trying to reclaim some imagined, lost inheritance. The bitterness that had defined him during their first meeting seemed to have drained away, leaving an old man who just wanted his remaining years to carry less resentment than the ones behind him. Robert came by regularly, sometimes with professional reasons related to ongoing research, sometimes just as a friend who understood what the past 2 years had cost her. He'd been offered a position at a prestigious Eastern university, but had turned it down, choosing to stay in California, where his work felt connected to actual places and communities rather than abstract academic debates. They'd grown closer in ways that felt comfortable and unforced, though neither had pushed beyond friendship into something more complicated. Claire wasn't ready for that, might never be ready, and Robert seemed to understand without needing explicit conversation about boundaries and expectations. "You've changed this place," he told her one evening while they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the meadow. "Not just physically, though that's obvious, but there's something different in how the land feels, like it's been holding its breath for a long time and can finally exhale." Claire considered that observation, thinking about Patrick's violence and Michael's rejection and the generations between who'd worked without knowing what lay beneath. Maybe the land was waiting for someone to acknowledge the truth. To stop pretending our family's claim to this place was simple or innocent. Maybe. Or maybe it was just waiting for someone like you, who could hold complexity without needing easy answers. The comment stayed with her long after Robert left, because it named something she'd only partially understood herself. The gold had forced her to live in uncertainty, to make decisions without knowing if they were right, to accept that good intentions didn't guarantee good outcomes. She'd distributed wealth she could have kept, honored claims she could have fought, and chosen transparency when concealment would have been easier. Whether those choices were objectively correct was impossible to know, but they'd been hers, made with as much integrity as she could manage while standing in the wreckage of discovered history. Elena proved to be not just competent, but transformative in her understanding of land management. She taught Claire about holistic grazing patterns that mimicked how wild herds moved across plains, about the relationships between soil microbes and plant health, about water cycles that started with healthy watersheds and ended with sustained productivity. Under her guidance, the ranch began producing more with less, carrying more cattle on the same acreage, because the grass was healthier, because the soil held moisture better, because they worked with natural systems rather than trying to dominate them. "Your husband understood some of this," Elena said one day, while they examined a pasture that had recovered from years of overuse. "But he didn't have the resources or the knowledge to implement it fully. Now you do. You're finishing what he started." The observation brought tears Claire hadn't expected, because it connected her current work to Thomas in ways she'd stopped hoping for. He'd loved this land, but had been trapped by financial constraints that limited his options, forced to manage for short-term survival rather than long-term health. The gold had broken those constraints for Claire, given her the freedom to manage according to ecological principles rather than purely economic necessity. In that sense, Patrick's stolen wealth had enabled something Thomas would have celebrated, even if the source remained morally compromised. She thought about that complexity constantly, about how good could emerge from bad origins, about whether outcomes justified sources or tainted them irrevocably. The questions had no final answers, but living with them had taught Claire something about moral maturity. Righteousness was easy when choices were clear. Integrity was harder when every option carried costs and benefits, when doing good required accepting complicity in historical harm. The second spring brought visitors she hadn't expected. A delegation from the California Historical Society wanted to honor her contribution to historical preservation and indigenous cultural support. She accepted their award at a ceremony in Sacramento, standing on a stage feeling deeply uncomfortable with praise for decisions that had felt less like virtue than necessity. But afterward, several indigenous leaders approached to thank her personally, and their words carried weight that official recognition hadn't. "What you did matters to our communities," a Maidu elder named George Bennett told her, his weathered hands gripping hers with surprising strength. Not because it fixed everything, but because it acknowledged that harm was done and tried to address it. That kind of honesty is rare, especially from people who benefit from historical injustice. Claire wanted to protest that she hadn't benefited, that she'd given away most of the gold. But she understood what he meant. She lived on land, taken from his people. She bore a name associated with violence against indigenous communities. Her choices about the gold didn't erase those facts, but they represented a different way of relating to uncomfortable history. Not denial or defensiveness, but acknowledgement and attempted repair. The ranch hands she'd hired both stayed on, learning skills that would serve them whether they remained in ranching or moved into related fields. She paid them well, offered benefits, treated them as partners in the work rather than temporary labor. One of them, a young man named Marcus Chen, Robert's nephew, showed particular aptitude for animal husbandry, and Claire began teaching him everything Thomas had taught her about reading cattle behavior and managing breeding programs. The knowledge passed forward, generation to generation, and that continuity felt more valuable than any amount of gold. Summer brought intense heat and drought conditions that tested everything they'd implemented. But the improved soil health meant pastures retained moisture longer, and the rotational grazing meant they had reserves to draw on when primary pastures dried up. They made it through without buying supplemental feed or reducing the herd, and Elena declared it proof that their management approach worked even under stress. "This is how you build resilience," she explained to Claire and Marcus during one of their regular planning sessions. "Not by fighting the land or trying to force it to produce regardless of conditions, but by working with its capacity and giving it room to recover. Your great-great-grandfather extracted value without regard for cost. You're building value by respecting limits." The contrast felt like a referendum on different philosophies of land use, different assumptions about human relationships to nature. Patrick had seen the land as something to conquer and exploit, to extract maximum value from, regardless of damage. Claire was learning to see it as something to partner with, to understand and respect and accept limitations from. The difference wasn't just environmental or economic, but fundamentally moral, about whether the world existed to serve human desires or whether humans were responsible for maintaining the systems that sustained all life. Fall brought the 2-year anniversary of finding the wagon, and Claire marked it by visiting the pond at sunrise, watching light spread across water that concealed its secrets again. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the sky like a mirror, giving no hint of what had been revealed and then reburied. She thought about Patrick, about Michael, about all the Donovans who'd lived on this land without knowing what lay beneath. She thought about Thomas, who'd suspected mysteries but never seen them confirmed. And she thought about herself, standing at the edge of water that held more history than any surface could reveal. Robert found her there an hour later, bringing coffee in a thermos and the comfortable silence of someone who knew when words weren't needed. They sat together watching the pond, and eventually Claire spoke. "I used to think finding the gold was the worst thing that could have happened. All the complications, all the difficult choices, all the ways it forced me to confront ugly history. But now, I think it might have been exactly what needed to happen. Not for me, but for the land. Like it finally got to tell its story after being silenced for generations. The land doesn't tell stories," Robert said gently. "People do. You chose to listen and honor what you heard. That's different from the land having agency. Maybe, but sometimes it feels like the land has memory, like it was waiting for someone who'd pay attention to what it remembered." They sat in silence after that, watching light move across water, and Claire felt something settle inside her that had been restless since Thomas died. Not happiness exactly, but acceptance of where she was and what she'd done and what still needed doing. The ranch would continue, the work would persist. The legacy she built would be measured not in wealth or recognition, but in soil health and water quality, and whether the land could sustain life better when she eventually left it than when she'd inherited it. Winter came again, the third since Thomas's death, and Claire found herself thinking less about what she'd lost and more about what remained. The ranch was thriving in ways that went beyond financial stability. Wildlife had returned, birds and deer, and even a mountain lion that Marcus had spotted near the upper pasture. The creek ran clearer because riparian restoration had reduced erosion. The grass grew thicker because soil microbes had recovered from years of chemical inputs. Everything was connected, every decision rippling outward in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for years. Sarah visited on Christmas Eve, bringing bread she'd baked and stories about Maidu winter traditions. They sat by the fireplace in the ranch house, and Sarah told Claire things she'd been waiting to share until she was certain Claire would understand properly. "This valley was sacred to my ancestors long before your people arrived," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "The pond where you found the gold sits on what we called the weeping place, where water emerged from beneath the earth and women came to pray for healing. Your grandfather didn't know that when he built the dam. But the land remembered, and when it was time for truth to emerge, the water itself helped reveal what had been hidden." Claire felt chills run down her spine, though the room was warm. "You think the pond leaking wasn't just structural failure? I think the land has its own timeline and its own ways of revealing what needs to be known. Whether you call that supernatural or just the physics of water and earth, the result is the same. You were shown something important at exactly the moment you needed to see it." They didn't speak after that, just sat watching flames consume wood and transform it to heat and light and ash. Outside, snow began falling, the first of the season, covering the ranch in white that made everything look new and unmarked. But beneath the snow, the land remembered everything, held all the stories, waited patiently for humans to understand that their brief claims to ownership were temporary interruptions in longer rhythms that predated them and would outlast them. Spring arrived eventually, as it always did, and with it came news that the museum exhibition was being made permanent, finding a home in Sacramento where it would educate generations of Californians about the true costs of gold rush prosperity. Patrick Donovan's name would live on, but not as a hero or pioneer, as a complicated figure whose violence and theft had been acknowledged by his own descendant. Claire took satisfaction in that, knowing the family story would be remembered with honesty rather than sanitized legend. She stood on the porch one morning in late March, watching the sun rise over hills that were impossibly green after winter rains, and felt Thomas's presence beside her not as ghost or memory, but as something woven into the land itself. His love for this place, his patient teaching, his belief that work done with integrity mattered more than work done for profit, all of it had shaped how she'd responded to discovering Patrick's gold. Thomas had shown her what mattered, and even in death, his values continued guiding her choices. The ranch would persist. The work would continue. New challenges would arise, and Claire would face them with the same commitment to honesty and stewardship that had defined her response to finding treasure beneath her grandfather's pond. The land would remember everything, hold all the stories, and offer itself again to those who approached with humility and respect. That was the real legacy, not what lay buried beneath the surface, but what grew from it when given the chance. And on quiet mornings when mist rose from the pond and cattle grazed in the distance and mountains emerged from darkness into light, Claire understood that she'd found something more valuable than gold. She'd found a way to live on this land without carrying the weight of unacknowledged history, without pretending her family's claim was innocent or simple. She'd found a way to honor both Thomas's love for the ranch and the truth about how it had been acquired. She'd found a way to be a Donovan who broke the pattern of extraction and began one of restoration. The sun climbed higher, burning off mist, revealing the valley in all its morning glory. Somewhere a hawk called. Cattle lowed softly. The land breathed quietly, holding its secrets and its promises in equal measure, offering itself again to anyone willing to work for it honestly and remember what it had witnessed. Claire turned toward the barn, where morning chores waited, where Elena and Marcus were already starting their day, where the patient work of maintaining life continued regardless of discoveries or revelations or the complicated legacies of ancestors long dead. This was home. This was heritage. This was the land finally breathing again after generations of holding secrets that had nearly crushed the woman who'd inherited them. And as Claire walked across ground her family had claimed for over a century and a half, she felt not the burden of that history, but the possibility of what it might become if tended with care and honesty and the kind of love that demanded nothing from the land except the chance to serve it well. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.